call to order a regular meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission, Florence, Arizona. Dana, I don't have your last name.
Burkhart.
Burkhart. Mr. Burkhart, would you take the roll, please?
Absolutely. Chairman Pranzo. Commissioner Chappelle.
Present.
Commissioner Schmidt.
Present.
Commissioner Frost.
Present.
Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Would you all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, moving right along. This is a discussion, approval, disapproval of the minutes of the regular meeting conducted on May 17th, 2018. I will open it up to the commission. Do we have any comments? Look pretty brown vanilla to me.
Okay. I move that we accept the minutes as submitted. I second that motion.
So we have a motion by Commissioner Schmidt, by Commissioner Schapel. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Minutes approved. Okay, new business. This is a work session / presentation and a discussion on the town proposed draft text amendments to implement state mandated small wireless facilities in town right of way. Let me guess, there is a presentation.
Chairman, there is.
Now, first, the way this is worded, I have a problem because we've gone to a work session. So now I have to make a motion and come out of the regular meeting and go into a work session. May I have a motion, please?
I'll make a motion that we
Recess the work session.
recess to a work session at this time.
A second?
Second.
I have a motion by Commissioner Schmidt, second by Commissioner Frost. All those in favor?
Aye.
We are recessed, gentlemen. Now, Mr. Burkhart, we are free to say whatever we want.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Chairman and Commissioners, I will try and be brief. If you recall, back in February 1st, I believe, Commission, I believe all of you were in attendance, initiated this town's effort to update the zoning code and our town code and policies to implement HB 2365, which is what we'll call a small wireless facilities legislation adopted back in, I think, May of 2017 by our state legislature. So what we have before you this evening is just a quick overview to warm you up to the materials that are involved. One thing I would say to begin is this legislation is very detailed. It's much more detailed and technical than a lot of other municipal regulations that we typically deal with on a land use standpoint. So it's unique, though we do see more of these as our communities grow. So that said, it is highly technical, and I'll try and keep it as simple as possible. HB 2365, in short, basically allows wireless providers to install and operate wireless facilities in the town rights of way. So we're strictly speaking about any wireless applications that come before the town within our town managed, owned, and operated rights of way. That's it. It really doesn't go out and beyond into private properties and other properties. The legislation sets the minimum fees that the towns can collect. Unlike cable and telco, where we have franchise agreements and so forth, this is a very different animal. It says we don't do franchise fees. We have to have exclusive or non-exclusive agreements, and standardizes the process. It also provides application and process for said facilities, including time frames and timelines and whole procedures for how we permit and license providers and permit the applications for facilities. And then finally, it requires a establishment of terms and conditions that are basically our agreement or our license, part of our license for how providers operate within our rights of way or operate their facilities. That said, we're going to primarily focus the next few slides are focusing on what the item number one, what are wireless facilities and what is being allowed in terms of wireless facilities. So first, any new replacement or modified utility pole that is associated with the co-location of a small wireless facility, which is a very specific equipment we'll get to in a moment, within the right-of-way, without zoning review or approval, so long as the utility pole does not exceed 10 feet above the tallest existing utility pole located within 500 feet within the same right-of-way, and does not exceed 50 feet in height, or the pole does not exceed 40 feet in height, generally. So any requests to place facilities, antennas on top of poles that exist in our rights-of-way that are over 50 feet would go through our zoning process. Second, it also allows any new small wireless facilities co-located on a utility pole or a wireless support structure in a right-of-way without zoning review or approval, so long as a facility does not extend more than 10 feet above that utility pole. And again, we have that other regulation too, that we need to make sure that it also, with that additional 10 feet, it's not going above our 50-foot mark. If it does, then it goes to our regular zoning process. Or structure, and the antenna array that's mounted on the pole is less than 6 cubic feet in volume or in area, and all the equipment in total is less than or equal to 28 cubic feet. So that includes the ground equipment. There's other switches and equipment that are on the pole itself for emergency shut-off, things of that nature. So that's where really this is most of the specific language of what is being allowed as a permitted use, as we're being told by the state.
Mr. Burkhart, let me interrupt for just a second. Who's going to steward this? Is this an APS thing?
Chairman Pranzo, if I can get some clarity, steward this moving forward or on behalf of the town?
Oh.
So moving forward, it'll fall under our existing procedures in town code, which I'll touch on, but it'll be a building permit ultimately after a provider receives a license, which I'll touch on. So we put it in our regular town processes. We just don't do a zoning review, and we don't apply certain, I should back up and add that the town's current wireless ordinance is somewhat simple and liberal, I think, on the provider's behalf.
Technically, we're really not equipped to be inspecting these kind of installations.
There's a few different groups that we have or agencies that would be a part of. I know FCC has to test and understand the signal that's being operated. I don't know those technical details. We do have a representative here that might be able to shed a little light on that for you. But within our parameters, our building official, we understand electrical connections, when we can power up a facility and so forth. And obviously, we have them currently in the community. I think we've approved about 4 in the last 4 or 5, 3 years, 2 or 3 years. So there is a process. We just might not have the technical expertise to understand how they operate. We will know a lot more as these get deployed.
All right.
Mr. Chairman?
Please, this is a work session. Just jump right in.
Dana, if I could, who owns the street lights and street light poles within Florence?
We do.
Good question. There's a few different entities. As you know, town owns streetlight poles within the town proper for the most part. We will, and then also there's SLIDs or street light improvement districts that have been approved out in Anthem, for instance. And they own those street poles that are within the town's rights of way. So evidence of ownership is part of the application process. So we know, so if it's a town-owned facility, we know, oh, HB 2365 applies, no zoning review. Everything we're discussing, modifying our codes to address today or this evening or discussing would apply. If it's not a town-owned, then it falls under our regular zoning requirements and permitting requirements.
So the slids out in the Anthem area that you referenced, are those owned by APS poles?
No, they're owned by the district, which is a separate political subdivision, an entity. So if Verizon, which they did, or Verizon went through a small 4G antenna in Anthem in a couple different locations 2 years ago or within the last 2 years. And right, the district would be the applicant or grant permission for Verizon to apply on their behalf. And that district would have their agreement or contract with that provider for leasing the space to operate. Whereas if it comes in on downtown here on a light utility pole that the town owns, then it's the town's agreement with them. And the statute that we're reviewing, that we're applying here, says, restricts our abilities, or just basically limits us and says, this is what you can charge, here's how you can fee this, and so forth, and here's the terms that you need, including a 10-year term that can be renewed for an additional 10 years. So that's really the bulk of that statute, how we engage and contract with providers, the town, on our property.
Dana, who determines where the locations are going to be for these devices?
The providers determine their locations based on their coverage and where their demand is. They come and meet with the town and say, we need an antenna in this area. We're light. We could use more service or more capacity. And then, so we review that, discuss it with them, and then they, we determine what the most feasible option is and then move forward. But it's a conversation.
Will you anticipate multiple providers, or are you isolating just one provider in general?
It's open to any provider that would like to locate on a town facility in a right-of-way.
Okay, and they all are...
Chairman?
Just to add to that.
No, excuse me.
Come on up and say your name and address.
Your name and address for the record, please.
Yes, your commissioners. Ryan Schaefer. My address is 2200 South University Boulevard in Denver, Colorado. I'm with the law firm of Sherman & Howard, and we're appearing on behalf of both Verizon Wireless and T-Mobile. I just wanted to make mention that it's specifically required in this ordinance, and I believe also in the Arizona statute, that the license agreements that the city reaches that guide the terms for the placement of these facilities require that they be non-discriminatory as among providers and allow for multiple co-locations, allow for potentially multiple facilities to be on the same pole. So all providers would be welcome, none would have an advantage to the city, and any provider could come into the city and provide service under the agreement based on the license terms that it would reach by negotiation with the city.
So by what you just said, then we could have multiple 6 cubic foot installations on the same pole.
Potentially. I'm not an engineer. I couldn't speak to the engineering. There's sometimes signal interference that comes with putting multiple antennas on the same pole, but the goal would be as much as possible to allow for the co-location of multiple facilities on the same pole so as to minimize the number of poles that are being occupied or potentially new poles that would need to be installed. New light poles, new utility poles.
This is interesting. Do you realize how large 6 cubic feet are?
I think we have some visual.
That's massive.
It sounds massive. I think we have visual depictions that show what these look like in practice. They're actually not, I would say I probably fit about 6 cubic feet. They're usually not my size, if we could reach that slide. Very frequently, they just look like boxes hanging off the side of the pole. That are, unless you know to look for them. So for example, these are 2 typical examples of the types of boxes that would be hanging off the poles. They look like appurtenant equipment. So for example, security cameras, parts of the utility. If they're attached to, for example, light posts, they look like any other equipment used by the public utility. I think generally they're not as visually obtrusive as 6 cubic feet would suggest. That number is more a function of.
Well, according to this, you could hang 4 of them on the same pole.
Conceivably, I think in practice, due to the engineering problems associated with multiple signals on the same pole. So the problem with this is that I'm not a physicist, but I think the idea is that if you have 2 signals pointing in the same direction at each other, they basically cancel each other out
Right.
and render both of them worthless.
But
So
I'm really thinking more about weight, and I think that's way out of your league. So we'll leave that there. It's startling to realize what our downtown could look like if somebody decided they had their favorite pole.
it was not my intention to take over Dana's presentation, so I'll let him finish.
So, Chairman Pranzo, and to that point, the statute also allows for objective design criteria to be applied. But however, discriminating or restricting somebody to locate on a pole, we need to make sure that the statute is going to support if we choose to go down that road or take a position one day to do that. I also have some other examples we'll move to after if you'd like to see a few other types of facilities that are small wireless. If you don't mind, I'll
Please
shift from
proceed.
the presentation here. T-Mobile sent these over today. As things that they are currently doing in Phoenix metro area. So this would be more of the backhaul facility, from what I understand, or something that they're looking at and to mount to facilities. And there's the example that T-Mobile is using, again, mounted up at the top of those 2 locations. That's the same pole, I believe. And then you see on the bottom, the ground equipment. And there's typically always ground equipment associated with it, which basically has the brains connects to the fiber underground, and so forth. And here you see it at this location. That is one of the more discreet I've seen. They have different configurations depending on the providers. And we can continue to explore or look at other examples in the coming weeks. And then here's similar type of facility located, same facility here again, their ground equipment. They've extended on top of that street light. Again, they can extend up to 10 feet as long as they're underneath the 50-foot maximum height the statute allows to attach their antenna. And here you see it on that street light.
This is going to be interesting because all of these samples you're showing me, their power is underground. Here in lovely Florence, all of our power is above ground, so it's going to be fun.
Well, to that point, for the first time, I saw a strand-mounted cell solution here that you see along the power line or the overhead utility lines.
All right, there you
It's
go.
a lineal placement. And there's another location. Here's a close-up, 2 close-ups actually of what those antennas look like. And the idea is to get, in lieu of, or I think the 5G technology is basically coming down to a more local level, more capacity. They found that the 4G and having those individual monopoles throughout communities communicating with each other, they're reaching capacity very quickly, and the amount of data that's going over these wireless antennas is growing exponentially by day. So a more distributed system is what the goal is, to be more effective. And then I think that's it. So those are other examples, and if you're interested, we can prepare and find others.
No, it's fine. You're just introducing us to something that it's going to be interesting in Florence.
Just as a question, Dan, just so I make sure that I'm understanding it correctly, these small antennas and stuff are designed to improve a small area, not a large, but just a small area, like a neighborhood?
Right, but in multiple areas, it ultimately improves the overall connectivity.
Yeah, a large.
So yes, yep, it's more specifically site-specific or area-specific capacity that they're increasing.
Entire network.
Right. More antennas basically closer to the people and closer to the areas to backhaul. I didn't realize switching all of the calls and data that go through those, you can quickly meet the capacity of one 4G tower, and that's when you start getting the bad signals or dropping calls and so forth. So over the years, they've done a number of different things, like backhaul. You'll see the microwaves, the large discs go up, and that's because they're sending the signal, they're switching to another cell tower that has more capacity to take on. So they'll just start sending calls to that other tower to backhaul to help, relieve the capacity or the requirement on that tower. So, right, this is to distribute it more evenly, I guess, throughout the community in the areas that need it, in stadiums or places that will receive, 100,000 people and have an incredible amount of data required for a very short period of time, where they can, set up and be able to meet that capacity as needed. And you also see these in canyons and places where there's much more vertical obstacles for the waves, for the wireless communication. So, like for instance, in California, back in the hills and the more expensive areas, they've been doing this on their street signs for some time now. DAS, distributed antenna system, I think, because they can't afford to go put up and fight the legislation to get a large, monopole up in the air in a beautiful hillside community. So instead, they've gone into the neighborhoods to be able to reach, provide services to those homeowners.
Dana, do you have any idea or an estimate of how many of these devices will be installed?
I don't. I read a report from the city of Scottsdale when they were going through this adoption process, and they said in the next, I think, 2 or 3 years, they could see either Phoenix, Scottsdale or Chandler, they equated it to up to 600 different applications. I don't know how they came to that number. I think Florence's capacity, it'll be some time because we just don't have the demand and population and
When you say Florence,
commercial network.
when you say Florence, I think Florence is 64 square miles, I believe, in territory, if I'm correct in my number. So that takes in quite a large area, but a lot of the area is inhabited because we have a lot of desert land. So you're strictly talking about communities where we have a great deal of housing, I would assume.
Exactly. The density drives it, as well as the commercial and the land use drives it as well, and what their requirements are. So as you grow, obviously. What I saw, I did a little bit of work over in Maricopa. Even here, you just received the 4G, some of those 4G antennas up in Anthem 2 years ago. That was deployed 6-8 years ago up in the valley. So definitely the provider's attention is on the high volume areas first, and then they come out to the other more lower density suburban locations. They follow the capacity wherever they need services, where they will add antennas.
So I can safely assume this will be a source of income for the town of Florence?
It's nominal with regards to this legislation. If it's in the right-of-way on a town-owned pole, we can no longer have an exclusive contract. So where the town may have in the past had an agreement or prepare, have a contract with the Verizon for $1,500 a month leasing fee. That ability's been removed by this legislation.
The lobbyists really did a good job on this one.
Sure did.
I think they wrote it. I'm sorry, Dana, I didn't mean to interrupt. Let's move forward.
Okay, so that's what a small cell is, and that basically is the whole emphasis of this legislation. And then finally, it excludes monopoles taller than 50 feet. So this is the one thing that excludes any request for, from a provider coming and saying, I need a pole. I'll put a light on it for you. If you need a street light, we'll do that. But it has to be under 50 feet to qualify for this. If it's over 50 feet, then it falls under our zoning code and in process, and we could do that exclusive agreement with them saying, yeah, you can do it, and we'll lease the land to you to do that, and this is what it's going to cost. So outside of these parameters that we just reviewed, it would fall under our current processes and lease requirements and so forth.
Forgive me, I didn't have the time to read that whole thing. When does HB 2365 become mandatory?
It was adopted in March or May. It becomes mandatory either on February 8th or 3 months after the first application or request we receive.
Okay.
So we have not received a request. So if we received a request tomorrow, 3 months from now, we'd have to have our ordinances adopted and in place. And I think we could work around that anyway, as long as we're not conflicting with the statutes.
All right, here's the picture I'm getting from the pessimist side, is that Verizon, T-Mobile, CenturyLink, whoever, and all of them have carte blanche, basically, to place things wherever they want, as long as it's under 50 feet, without intervention by the town. Is that correct to say that?
No, the town reviews it. If we have policies on what our light standards look like, what our traffic signals look like, how they're spaced apart, and where they're located. So it needs to, if it's a light or a monopole, we do have definitely public safety, life safety review responsibilities to make sure it's in a location. And again, we have aesthetics, we have design review as well. So if we know it's going in place, or there's a clear conflict visually or something like that, we would work through that.
That's where I'm getting lost. When does the permit application kick in? I thought I saw somewhere in here that there are instances when no permit is required.
A building permit will always be issued. We just don't have the ability to do the zoning review or require a conditional use permit, or it's essentially a permitted use. And the town has a responsibility, should we receive an application? Mm-hmm. So you know what, I'd prefer if we'll roll through the presentation, because we're starting to get ahead in the presentation. I got to explain to you the process.
Please.
For any application that comes through, and then we'll go back and
right.
Probably have more specific questions to it. So an overview of the proposed text amendments and policy that the town is looking at that's been prepared and that's in your packets includes an amendment to the town code. Mm-hmm. Like I said before, it's just like our cable. We've got a cable provider business section, telecommunications business section, which all require licenses. Now we have this license as well, and provision in the town code. Then the land development code has some minor tweaks and modifications to make sure we're carving out and not subjecting what's been written to not subject to zoning responsibilities. So we did some minor modifications and we touch a few other areas. And then we have to have terms and conditions. It's part of the statute. It says, yeah, and the town will have an agreement and a contract and terms and conditions in place that are mutually, that don't discriminate there. It's a basic contract that we have with all providers. And we do have the ability to make tweaks with the provider depending on the scenario for individuals, for their situation. But we have a terms and conditions. I'll tell you that terms and conditions is the lightning rod of this whole legislation.
Sounds like
With us and the providers at least. That's the focus of attention. They know what they're allowed to do. Now, what are those terms and conditions and how they perform and responsibilities within that? And same with the town, because we have review responsibilities and timeframes to meet, as well as fees and so forth. So this is just to give you a look at where that's added. We're currently using the same format that most of our public sees from our Municode, where our codes are published. So just to keep it consistent, if you go online, look at our codes online, that's what it looks like. And like I mentioned, 117 telecommunication service, 118 cable communications. This is a very similar, though they are treated differently. Here's a breakdown of just the overall. There's a purpose and an intent, really explaining what the town's purpose and goal is. Definitions in the town code refer specifically or reference the statute definitions. Again, they're very specific as to what that is. We simply refer to the statute. Then a license is required. Any provider would come into the community. Some other communities call it a master license. We've chose to just try and keep this as simple as possible and say there's a license. So if Verizon would like to operate in the community, they have an application process that they apply through the manager's office, and then ultimately council reviews the application and grants a license for them to begin to request permits for antennas and facilities within our rights-of-way. So there's a licensing provision in there. And with that license, obviously, the terms and conditions are a part of that in the contract. Then .04 basically defines the scope of what a small wireless facility is and some of the steps from a town code perspective and how the town is to operate and to process those licenses and applications and permits. And then the application process is spelled out, and then finally we have to adopt rates and fees that are in line. So town council will also see an adoption of the rates and fees. You see a good example in the packet. I think it's Exhibit D, which has an example or a good summary of this legislation and its impacts to communities from the League of Cities. And at the very end of that, you'll see basically the fixed fees that the states adopted for the municipalities. Okay. The Land Development Code, we amended the definitions right there on top. We had to add a few definitions to be specific and carve out, again, small wireless facilities. And then Part 9 is the wireless communications facility ordinance for the town. It's formatted to be consistent with other titles, so we just made some minor cleanups in it to have it read in a way similar to our other chapters in a more contemporary, clear code approach. And then we expanded the administrative review and approval section by carving out the small cell wireless. Monopoles are already covered, and our current ordinance is almost less restrictive than the statute as it's applied to on private properties. So we're not far off of already. Really, it's going into the town rights away is the big change, but like I mentioned, the current wireless ordinance is probably one of the more liberal and favorable to a provider. Then design criteria, we just made some minor tweaks to update and allow provider contact information signage. Previously it restricted signage. We need to know who owns that facility and who to call right away if there's an emergency. We made another modification to our towers ordinance to restrict the lattice and guy wire towers. That's kind of in wireless communications, that's been retired for the most part. So we went ahead and made that change. Usually you'll see monopoles or co-locations. Just put it on something existing that's tall and we're already looking at. So, and then finally, any additional height. There is going to be one minor change you're going to see on the version 2. We struck, there's a provision that allows, restricts wireless towers and antennas to the 10 foot above the existing zoning height, of the existing development standard height in that zoning district. I went back, looked at other codes, or projects that have been approved, and we think that 10 feet, is going to be, we'll replace that 10 feet basically in the code. So just letting you know, you'll see a strike through, it's going to come back because it's in line with the statute in terms of for city properties, and it's been working fine for private properties. So no harm, no foul there unless the commission has seen issues or are aware of other issues that you'd like to address with this. But I would note that I have not been made aware of any challenges or issues the town has had with any of the wireless applications currently in place in the community.
All right. Here's the problem.
And then finally, terms and conditions. Required by statute, council will adopt it in form as well as a contract and an application format. Obviously, the Planning and Zoning Commission ultimately will make a recommendation on the zoning ordinance, and we'll take any feedback on any of these documents from you or the public. And then we're finally working through some final provisions as well in some of the terms and conditions. But we'll have all that nailed down probably by the next time I'm before you, and we're thinking next meeting. And then finally, discussion and questions.
Okay. You covered a lot of ground pretty quick.
Sure did.
And I guess, this is an area where very few people are going to have the sophistication to get their arms around. And so what it boils down to is, where's the model? What towns or municipalities have been experiencing this, and do we have access to their feedback in order to create a model that will work for Florence?
Chairman Pranzo, commissioners, absolutely. We didn't start this blindly. There's been groups or basically an organization of Valley municipalities having monthly discussions on this, and we see who's ahead of what and who's doing what. Your terms and conditions are very similarly aligned with Avondale's. So if you take a look at what they've done, I think they're probably well ahead of most of the other municipalities in design guidelines, their contract application, and their codes and their terms and conditions. So that's one model. And then we cross-reference and just look for what would we be missing or what didn't we think of. Town code, looked at another communities because we wanted to, that's where we wanted it to include those provisions. It's more of a license like
Right.
cable. So we look for a community that address it that way. Other communities go real heavy like Scottsdale and Phoenix. Surprise, have completely redone their wireless codes because they've had historically very detailed design guidelines and restraints and constrictions on all the different types of wireless facilities and
Right.
monopoles and stealth and so forth. So that would be their ordinances are longer than, at least half of, your wireless ordinance would be almost half of your zoning ordinance in depth and detail. So we haven't found that need down here, or haven't, like I said, been made aware of a big issue with the current procedures, so we didn't want to open up that can.
Right. Don't misunderstand. I'm not questioning your professionalism. I'm just interested in the models that have been developed and how well they're working for those communities. Because rolling something like this out in Florence, whether it's the commission, and nothing against the gentleman sitting here with me, or the town council, we're pretty much going to go along with what other communities are doing. So it's important that the model we're using comes as close to us as possible. And then we're going to learn. We'll have a couple of oops and we don't like it, and there'll be changes. But I want to make sure that we're focusing on something that'll work well for us, at least from the start. And that brings me to the other question. I understand that there are groups working through this. I used to participate in a in code writing with a code called ASME, American Society of Mechanical Engineers, and that was made up of utilities, users, contractors, municipalities. Are there any groups that are being put together as representing all of the entities, the power company poles, the wireless provider, the municipality, whatever? Is there anything that brings this all to a consensus?
So locally, like I mentioned, it's I think it's called the State Telecommunications Committee.
Oh, okay.
That has been moving around to different communities to host agendas and dialogue on all the different nuances that have come up for cable, all the different utilities as well, but lately, obviously,
Right.
this has been a focus. And they do meet. I've sat on phone calls to listen in
Great.
and hear, but they're getting into a lot of very deep detail because they're seeing applications come through. So then now they're starting to talk about their practical knowledge. And then Ryan may be aware of other groups.
No, I'm just interested in how this comes together. You know, a lot of words get written, but you don't know who participated. You know, it's that kind of a thing. And we start hanging things on poles, and it can get out of control rather quick. Depending on, I mean, I know Florence is not going to be the focus of Communication Center for Arizona, but still, we're an old community, and change comes hard to us sometimes. So I just want to make sure we're going down the right path.
Dana, what are the plans to make the public aware of this project?
Thank you, Chairman Pranzo, Commissioner Chappelle. We have the information with the PIO. I haven't looked at our Facebook page if he's announced that or made mention. It is in process. So next time we meet, ideally by tomorrow or Monday, these policies will be up on the website. We do already have version 2 comments. Just today I received comments from one of the providers that will go back, and so we'll probably push it to maybe Wednesday and release an update with some minor tweaks. I met with the attorney today to land on some final decisions on some of our terms and conditions and insurance responsibilities and so forth. And I haven't notified our stakeholders yet. So we'll work through that, get that package done, and do a media push, including a local paper, obviously social media, all town social media outlets and all other outlets we have. City manager our town manager was to make a mention at an announcement at town council on Monday, this past Monday. So we'll be reaching through all our outlets.
Well, I'd like to commend you on the presentation. There's a lot of information that has been covered, and I appreciate your diligence. You know, Florence has experienced development over the last 15 years or so, and sometimes we're naive and we're on the wrong side of the fence. The developer, I should say, knows where he's going to have us at step M and N, and we're only on step A. And I appreciate your diligence to keep us from being maneuvered to somebody else's desires. So, thank you.
Did you want some comments on the document this evening? Some things that I read in there that raised an eyebrow or caused a question?
A couple ways. If you need clarity, we can discuss it now. If you prefer to submit it in writing, and we can go through it. But yeah, absolutely, whatever your preferred format.
I'll just run through it then really quick. This would be in the red letter sections, chapter 120, the second page.
Okay, so that's the zoning, the town code.
Chapter 120, small wireless facilities.
Yes, town code.
All the red letter stuff, the new language is being proposed.
Correct.
Second page, 120.04, paragraph E, elephant. I read this twice and I still can't figure it out. I kept reading, I still haven't figured it out. About the third line from the bottom, it says, but the new pole cannot be more than 50 feet above ground or 40 feet above ground level. Now, the more I read that, the more, something's wrong there. I just point that out to you. That needs a rewrite.
You know, I hung up on that earlier today. Yes, so what it's saying, the shall, yes, we'll clarify that. I had to read that twice myself, and I made sense of it just to let you know how, in short, starting from the top, in addition to the above requirements, the installation, replacement, modification of utility poles exceed the greater of either these two items and shall be subject to requirements of Part 9 or be subject to our zoning code. So we'll make sure that reads
Yeah,
better.
it just needs to be rewritten. There's something wrong there. And then on the next page, 120.05, in subsection B, when it says, it talks about all the things that they're going to provide when they propose something. One of the things I noted there, and I believe Chairman Prazo pointed out earlier, nowhere is weight mentioned. And weight, it could be a critical factor in the structural integrity of these poles. And then section B, subsection number 4, where it says a resubmitted application cannot be denied for a deficiency not identified in the original denial from the town. That basically says we will never make an error. Is that what we want to say? If we happen to miss it in the first go around and we see it in the second, it doesn't count?
That's how the statute
Oh, really?
was written.
Wow.
The town or city cannot deny an application for items that weren't previously commented on.
Oh, my goodness.
Which is also similar to the substantive. If you guys, I don't know if you remember SB 1598, which was the completeness, the reviews, and how the city issues permits, and it's very similar language, kind of tying us down, saying, hey, if you missed the boat and didn't make a comment, you're not going to bring it up in the third review or second review.
Okay, well, I just wanted to, that's pretty, that means we're going to have to be very, very careful and good on our reviews. That's all that means. So, okay, well, that is what it is. Subsection C, subparagraph 5 down below there. All other applicable town codes. The one thing I'm missing there is the structural load calculations.
I added that.
Because each pole manufacturer is going to have different structural requirements and calculations and wind loads, and et cetera, for poles.
Exactly
Okay?
right.
And then now I turn to, let's see, Exhibit B, boy.
Yep.
Under the definitions, a monopole. And in the second line there it says, has all the wireless facilities mounted on or inside of the pole. But then on the next page, it talks about all their wireless equipment that is cumulatively not more than 28 cubic feet in volume, and then it excludes all these other things. Now, if I'm reading that right, a monopole will have nothing except the monopole. There will be no other ancillary stuff ground mounted around that. Is that correct?
No, even a monopole would usually still have a ground enclosure. And usually if it's a monopole, it's a big antenna, like the 4G that you see, and they'll probably have cooling for the backhaul
Right.
equipment and device, so they do have it. It's saying, basically it's carving out what a monopole is relative to a lattice or any other type of
Right.
structure. It's a single pole. Things are going to be attached on the outside of it, but the idea is that it closes, has a chase for all the guts and a lot of the wiring and everything on the interior. Now, the wireless communication facility section definition there is very specific to carve out. This is what the legislation is really directed to apply to, and that's why it gets very detailed on all the different appurtenances.
Okay. And then about 2 more pages, section 150.182, under required information. Subsection B, Part 1A, I think, when I read this, I added some language, and it basically says, report from a structural engineer registered in the state showing the tower antenna capacity by type and number, and a certification that the tower, and I put, and attached equipment is designed to withstand winds. Because a lot of stuff can get attached to that. So I added the words "and attached equipment," just for your,
Make that update.
okay, and then on the next page, section 150.183, design criteria, subsection B, where it talks about, and this is mentioned later in the document as well, about signage being added to that and what can be put there. And it says it may. You would think that you would want this will be attached.
Shall be attached.
And then it's another spot in here too. So that was a question mark. It seems like you'd want to know some of that information. Okay.
And back to B real quick, does it, no signage shall be allowed on the antenna and communication tower except signs identifying operator provider contact info,
Right.
restricting trespass, or warning of life safety risks and other notification. That's what can go on it.
Right. Later in the
You're saying
document,
it
there's
should.
another spot where it talks about the same thing, and it says may.
Oh, and the terms and conditions.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, but it seems like you'd want this on there. Okay, I'll try to keep going fast here. Exhibit C. Under definitions, 1.8 monopole. I think we're missing the word "or" there. Second to last line has all the wireless facilities mounted on the pole or contained inside the pole. We need to add the word "or" because it's just like it was omitted there.
Yeah. Thank you.
And then the next page, paragraph 1.16. There's a term used in the third line from the bottom called cable route. It's capitalized, but it's not a defined term. And then jumping over to about 3 or 4 more pages along, where we're under section 4, standards for installation, operations and maintenance. One of the things that kind of raised my eyebrow here is in 4.5 that talks about an annual permit for emergency operations, and drawing from previous experience working with utilities, a lot of things can be called emergencies that allow them to go out there when it's really just normal maintenance, and they're blocking. They might have blocked a lane of traffic, and all of a sudden we've got police, fire, and others that are trying to do things, and there's a lane of traffic blocked that they knew nothing about. Or we're trying to do public works operations, and there's stuff blocked that no one knew it about. So I'm wondering about normal maintenance operations, how they're to notify the municipality that, hey, we would like to shut down this area because we need to work on this, and we need to give you a heads up. I just don't see that normal operational notification here. Oh, and here's on 4.12 is that signage thing, except maybe. I would think we would want a shall there. And then on section 9, safety program for town's employees. I like the title of it, but the only program is a kill switch. I'm thinking maybe we might want to have some sort of annual safety training where we have the providers come in and talk to our people that are going to be working around their equipment to say, here's what to see. If you see this, do this, or give us a call or whatever, just a kind of a heads up as to what they're getting into, kind of what Chairman was talking about earlier.
Is that 4.18?
That's section 9. safety program for town's employees.
Yeah, there really needs to be a toolbox safety program.
Just some, it's going to call it a program, it's got to be more than just a kill switch and call this guy if there's a problem, I guess. That was my first read through it anyway, so I guess that's my only shot at it if, if it's like this. But anyway, that's a few comments that I had.
This will come before us again.
Until you make a recommendation to council, that's your final shot. So, correct, if I could, thank you very much.
I just saw one other note that I made. A typical street light has a life expectancy of somewhere between 25 and 30 years, if I'm remembering correctly. And so if one of our good cell phone providers goes out and hangs equipment on a pole that is approaching the end of its life, then we've got an installation there that, you know, it might cause premature aging and problems with the pole. I don't really see anything in here about, you know, what hanging stuff on a pole does to its life expectancy.
So there is provision in it that says once the town determines that a street light needs to be replaced, we notify them, and at their sole cost and expense, they remove their equipment and we replace the light pole, and then they put it back. Or, you know, what would likely happen is, can you guys replace that light for us?
And that part I understand. I'm just thinking that in a normal, if the municipality is being proactive, they programmed into their budget to take care of this pole because of life expectancy, let's say in 5 years, but now, because of hanging this stuff on it, now they've got to do it instead of 5 years from now, they've got to do it 2 years from now, and they don't have money budgeted for it. You know, obviously the cell phone provider is going to come in with their portion, but this has been basically pushed a budgeting scenario quicker because of the premature aging of the pole. I don't see that really addressed here.
They might be able to approach it from the standpoint that the equipment doesn't go on a pole that's gone past a certain age. Whereas
5% of its life expectancy.
Yeah, it's a compromise, good compromise.
It's just, unless we have something there that they say they're going to pay some pro rata share of, that pole has a life expectancy of 10 years, hanging this stuff on it brings it to 5, so they're going to pay for the difference. I don't know.
I'll address that and have a response or a follow-up to what we end up with.
That was it.
that's a good point.
That's a real good point.
Yeah.
Well, does the
Especially some-
equipment that we're hanging on these poles, or they're going to be hanging on, do they adversely affect the life expectancy of the poles?
Well, clearly, it puts a load on the pole. You know, you have more metals involved, so there's going to be some, some
Wind loading.
issue. I'll look into that further, see how other municipalities are dealing with the aging with these antennas on them, and we'll be prepared to explain that at the next meeting.
That'll be interesting around Florence. Do we have anything else? Are you happy, Mr. Burkhart?
I appreciate it very much,
Okay, then
Chairman and Commissioners.
I'll ask for a motion to recess from work session, or let's just do it this way. I make a motion that we recess from work session and continue with our regular meeting. Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
All those in favor?
Aye.
We're back in session. Okay, moving right along. Call of the public. I hate reading this. Call the public for public comment on issues within the jurisdiction of the Planning and Zoning Commission. Individual commission members may respond to criticisms made, may ask staff to review a matter raised, or may ask that the matter be put on a future agenda. However, members of the commission shall not discuss or take action on any matter during an open call to the public unless the matters are properly noticed for discussion and legal action. And I will close it to the public. Moving right along, call to the commission, current events only. Do we have any current events? Commissioner Frost, please.
Thank you, sir. Dana, do we have a new staff member sitting to your left?
Well, stand and be
Chairman
recognized.
Pranzo, Vice Chair Frost, my apologies. This is Marcella Benitez from Chandler, Arizona, graduate of NAU in urban planning. And we're excited to have her on board. She's been on board, I think, for, gosh, probably 3 weeks now.
So you're part of staff? Turn your microphone on, Marcella. I like chicken
goes.
Marcella myself, but okay.
There it goes. So, yes, I'm the new planner with the development department.
Okay, and you're working with Mr. Harmon?
The what?
You're working with Mr. Harmon?
Wait, yes, with Larry.
Okay, and how do you find Florence? What do you think of us?
I am just in love with the historic part of it. I'm a big history junkie, so going and looking around at all these historic properties made me very excited about working here.
Oh, good, good. So you like the historic district?
I do very much.
Great, then you're going to be an asset. We're going to talk more.
Okay,
Welcome aboard.
thank you.
Yes, and good luck to you.
Probably need it.
Anything else? Everybody's happy, then I will close the call to the commission and ask for a motion to adjourn.
I move that we adjourn at this time.
I second the motion.
So I have a motion by Commissioner Schmidt, second by Commissioner
Chappelle?
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those against? We are adjourned.